Atlantis and the Aryan Race. Edgar Cayce's Atlantis series of 4 major readings. 364 to 10, 378 to 13, 378 to 14, and 2329-3, 364. Roughly a few centuries ago, Atlantis was in the period that lasted from 210,000 BC to 10,014 BC. Map showing the tiny Atlantis of the largest Lemurian continent in what is now the Pacific Ocean, from the story of Atlantis and Lemuria. Plato, 427 to 347 BC, stated that tens of thousands of years ago various volcanic eruptions occurred simultaneously, causing earthquakes, melting ice, and flooding. This incident caused part of the Earth's surface to sink. That part is what he calls the lost continent or Atlantis. Recent research conducted by Eriso Santos confirms that Atlantis is an area that is now called Indonesia. After doing research for 30 years, he produced the book Atlantis, The Lost Continent Finally Found, the definitive localization of Plato's Lost Civilization, 2005. Santos presented 33 comparisons, such as area, weather, natural resources, volcanoes, and farming methods, which finally concluded that Atlantis was Indonesia. According to him, the rice terracing system that is unique to Indonesia is the form adopted by Borobudur, the pyramids in Egypt, and the ancient Aztec buildings in Mexico. Indonesian context. It is not a coincidence when Indonesia was in 1958, on Professor Dr. Mokhtar Kusumatmaja through Law No. 4 Perpu 1960, promulgated the Joanda Declaration. Its content states that the state of Indonesia with its inland waters is a unitary territory of the archipelago. This fact was later recognized by the 1982 International Convention on the Law of the Sea. Referring to Santo's research, in the past tens of thousands of years, the territory of Indonesia was a unified continent. It is not fragmented in tens of thousands of islands as it is now. Santos determined that in the past Atlantis was a continent stretching from the southern part of India, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, Java, Kalimantan, continuing eastward with Indonesia now as its center. In that area, there are dozens of active volcanoes and are surrounded by a unified ocean called Oriental, consisting of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Plato's theory explains that Atlantis is a continent that was lost due to a volcanic eruption that simultaneously erupted. At that time most parts of the world were still covered by ice sheets, Pleistocene era. With the eruption of dozens of volcanoes simultaneously, most of which were located in the territory of Indonesia, formerly, part of the continent sank and was covered by water from the melting ice. The real record of Atlantis according to Timaeus and Criteus. The Atlantis described by Plato was a nation that actually existed in history, and Hitler even believed that the Aryans were the direct descendants of Atlantis, which led him to order the search for this continent. Plato's classical text, Criteus by Plato 360 BC, translated by Benjamin Jowett, New York, c. Scribner Sons. Plato's Timaeus and Criteus, written in 347 BC. These pieces are translated from Benjamin Jowett's English version of Timaeus and Criteus. Timaeus and Criteus is a book written in the form of a dialogue that occurs between Timaeus, Criteus, Hermocrates, and Socrates. In that book, the story of Atlantis is told by Criteus, who heard the story from his grandfather who was also named Criteus. Meanwhile Criteus, the grandfather, heard it from Solon. And Solon heard it from the Egyptian priests. Timaeus said little about Atlantis. Meanwhile, Criteus describes more of Atlantis. However, Criteus seems to have not been completed by Plato. In the discussion below, the writer will explain the image engraved on the Borobudur relief according to what Plato told in the dialogue contained in his book. In the author's book entitled Borobudur Bukan Candi and Borobudur True Back History, it is explained in detail that Borobudur was not built by Wangsa Sailendra and was not a Buddhist or Hindu temple. The location of Atlantis. This power came from the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, the Atlantic was navigable and there was an island in front of the strait which you call the Pillars of Hercules. The island was wider than Libya and Asia combined, and these pillars were also the entrance to the other islands around it, and from them you can reach the entire continent which borders the Atlantic Sea. The sea within the Pillars of Hercules is just like a port with a narrow entrance. But the sea outside it is a real sea, and the continents that surround it can be called continents without borders. In this area of Atlantis, there was a large empire that ruled the entire island and other islands around it as well as parts of other continents. Timaeus. The origin of the people of Atlantis. Previously I have talked about the division of the territories held for the gods and how they are spread throughout the world in different proportions. And Poseidon received his share, namely the island of Atlantis. Criteus. In the center of the island there was a plain which was considered the best and had fertile land. There was a mountain which was not very high on either side. On that mountain lived a man named Evenor who had a wife named Leucippe. They have one daughter named Cleito. When Cleito was an adult, his mother and father died. Poseidon falls in love and has sex with him. Criteus. The name Cleito, which Plato calls it, is identical to the Chetho building described above. Characteristics of the land of Atlantis. Poseidon then broke the ground around the hill where Cleito lived so that the hill was separated from the other plains. The hill is now surrounded by a circular sea. Poseidon made 2 parts of land like this so that the total is 2 lands surrounded by 3 water areas. Criteus. Each landmass has a circumferent equidistance from the center of the island. So no one person and one ship can reach the island. Poseidon then made 2 springs in the middle of the island, one warm water and one cold water. He also made all kinds of food emerge from the fertile soil. Criteus. Ancestors of the Atlanteans. Poseidon and Cleito had 5 sets of male twins. He then divided the island of Atlantis into 10 parts. He gave the eldest to the first twins the place of their mother's residence and the area that surrounds it, which is the widest and best land. He also made him king upon his brethren. Poseidon gave the boy the name Atlas. And so the whole island and the oceans were called the Atlantic. Criteus. Pay attention to 10 figures of people and one person who may be their parents. Prosperity of the Atlanteans. The land of Atlantis is the best land in the world and therefore capable of accommodating large numbers of troops. Criteus. The land also benefits from the annual rainfall, has abundant supplies all over the place. Criteus. Orichalcum can be excavated in many parts of the island. At that time orichalcum was more valuable than anything of value, except gold. On the island there was also a lot of wood for carpentry and a sufficient supply of livestock or wild animals, who live on rivers or land, who live on mountains or plains. Even on that island there are also many elephants. Criteus. Structure of the Atlantis society. At that time, the territory of Atlantis was inhabited by various classes of society. There were masons, carpenters, husbands and soldiers. For the soldiers, they got their own territory and all the necessities for life and education were provided in abundance. They were never consider that what they have is their own. They regard it as their common possession. They also never demand more food than is needed. Criteus. These soldiers lived in the vicinity of the temples of Athena and Hephaestus at the top of the hill. In that place they then made a fence to protect the place. To the north, they built a room for eating in winter and made buildings that could be used for common needs. Criteus. They do not worship gold and silver because for them, all that is useless. They also build simple houses where their children can grow. Criteus. This is their way of life. They are the custodians of their own people and the leaders of all the Hellenists who voluntarily follow them. Then they also keep the same number of women and men in case a war breaks out. In this way they administered their territory and the entire Hellas region fairly. Atlantis became very famous throughout Europe and Asia because of the good looks and kindness of its inhabitants. Criteus. Atlantis Technology. They built temples, palaces and harbors. They also governed the whole territory in the following order. First they built bridges to connect the water area with the land surrounding the ancient city. Then made roads to and from the palace. They built palaces on the spot, the residences of the gods and their ancestors who were continuously preserved by the next generation. Each king passed on his extraordinary abilities to the next king until they were able to build extraordinarily large and beautiful buildings. Criteus. And they built a canal 300 feet wide with a depth of 100 feet and a length of 50 stadia, 9 kilometers. They also made an inlet large enough for even the largest ships to pass through, and through this canal they can sail towards the outer zone. Criteus. Destruction of the island of Atlantis. 9,000 years is the number of years that have passed since the war that took place between those who dwelt outside the Pillars of Hercules and those who dwelt in them. It is this war one will describe. Criteus. One army was led by the cities of Athens. On the other hand, the troops were led directly by the kings of Atlantis, that is, as I have explained, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, which was then destroyed by an earthquake, and become a pile of mud that becomes a barrier for explorers sailing to other parts of the ocean. Criteus. Many floods have occurred during the 9,000 years, that is, the number of years that have occurred as I speak. And during that time there have also been many changes. Never in history has so much accumulated land fallen from the mountains in one region. Had fallen and buried the area of Atlantis and covered it from sight. Criteus. Because only overnight, extremely heavy rains swept across the earth and at the same time an earthquake occurred. Then there was a flood that inundated the whole region. Criteus. But after that, there appeared a terrible earthquake and flood. And in one day and one night, all the inhabitants sank into the bowels of the earth and the island of Atlantis disappeared into the great ocean. And for this reason, parts of the ocean there became impassable and unexplored. Because there is a pile of mud caused by the destruction of the island. Timaeus. Zeus, the king of the gods who ruled according to the law and was able to see the evil deeds they were doing, began to punish that honorable race so that they could be awakened and purified. Then he began to gather the gods from their respective residences. All gathered, Zeus said, Criteus. And with that sentence Criteus ended, unresolved. Dialogue. Criteus, Hermocrates, Timaeus, Socrates. Here is a snippet of dialogue in Plato's book in translated Greek text. Let me begin by observing first of all, that 9,000 is the number of years that have passed since the war which is said to have occurred between those who lived outside the pillars of Heracles. This war one will explain. From other powers on the one hand, the city of Athens is reported to have had a leader and had fought its way out of the war. The territory on the other hand was commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which was the larger island on the boundary of Libya and Asia, and when it was submerged by an earthquake, became a passable barrier of mud for sailors sailing from here to every part of the sea. That historical progress will reveal the various barbarian nations and families of Hellenes who later existed, as they successively appeared on the scene, but I have to describe first Athena of that day, and their enemies who fought with them, and hence the respective powers and governments of the two kingdoms. Let us give priority to Athens. In the old days the gods have spread the whole earth between them by rationing. No fighting. For you cannot properly suppose that the gods do not know what is right for each of them to have, or, knowing this, that they will strive to get for themselves on the presumption that the better belongs to someone else. They are all those with only a share obtained what they desire in their own dwelling and their possessions, as shepherds of their flocks. Hephaestus and Athena, who were brothers and sisters, from the same father, had a common character, and united also in the love of philosophy and art, both of which were acquired as their common share of this land, naturally adapted for wisdom and virtue. And there they are trained as brave and clever children to rule their territory or the people who live in the mountains, and they do not know the art of writing, and hear only the names of the leaders of the land, but very little about their actions. Regarding this country the Egyptian priests said what was not only possible but evidently true, that the boundaries which were on that day were established by the isthmus, and to which their continents extended as far as the heights of Cithaeron and Parnes. The boundary descends in the direction of the sea, has the district of Oropus on the right, and with the river Asopus as the boundary on the left. The land is the best in the world, and therefore it can be in those days to support a great army, raised from the surrounding people. Even the present-day remains of Attica can compare with regions of the world for the variety and superiority of fruits and pastures for each animal breed, which proves what I'm saying. The whole country is just a long headland stretching deep into the sea away from the rest of the continent, while the basins surrounding the ocean are everywhere deep in the coastal environment. Many great deluges have occurred over the course of 9,000 years, for which number of years have passed since the time of which I speak. And during all this time and through so many changes, there was once a sufficient accumulation of land descending from the mountains, as elsewhere, but disaster submerged the land. The consequence is, as in the case of islets, all the richer and softer parts of the land have high mountains, the hills are covered with earth, and the plains, as we call them, of Phelleus are full of rich earth, and there is an abundance of wood in the mountains. From this last trace still remains, for although some of the mountains are now of wood cut from the trees growing there, which are of a size sufficient to cover the largest of houses, and there are many other tall trees, cultivated by humans and much forage for livestock.